Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to RMIT's Story Hall. I'm Suzanne Davies, Director of the RMIT Gallery, which is immediately below us. We are delighted that you're joining us this evening for the showing of B-Movie, Lust and Sound in West Berlin. For those of you who've been to RMIT functions, you would know, or that functions that are connected to the gallery, you would know that we address the location of this gallery, and we do so in the spirit of reconciliation. And we acknowledge that this building, Story Hall, located on the land for which the Wurundjeri and their forebears are the traditional people. And we recognise the cultural and historical significance of this site to those people. We're delighted to be able to present this free screening as part of the Goethe Institut's international exhibition, Geniale Dilletanten, Subculture in Germany in the 1980s, which is on show downstairs in RMIT Gallery, where we also have a little taste of Australian subculture of the same period, represented in our exhibition, Australian Ingenious Amateurs. The exhibition opened last night and will run till 27 February, which is the night of White Night, when we will be open for 24 hours, which is a bit of we all end up very tired. And if you haven't already done so, we urge you to see the exhibition. There's plenty to interact with and some extraordinarily powerful images, sounds, and visceral experiences to be had. There's also a major public program that we've attached with our partners, the Goethe Institut, and available at the end of the showing is the invitation, and on the back are all the public programs which you are most welcome to take part in. As this is a special viewing of the movie, which we've been obliged to advertise as unclassified and strictly 18 plus. So if any of you look younger than 18, I apologise, because you would have been asked to present your ID. I'm also obliged to point out that there may be some scenes that could be a cause for distress for some viewers. So if you're a sensitive soul about certain topics, just avert your gaze.
Oh, okay.
B-Movie Lust and Sound in West Berlin is, we've decided to describe as a wild ride through music, art and social chaos in West Berlin in the 1980s. What we've planned is a short discussion, an introductory talk, artists, subcultures and squatters. Berlin at the end of the Cold War, and it's presented by the RMIT's European Union Centre. Our speakers tonight, to my right, and some of you I see were here last night, I recognise your faces. Mathilde Weh, who's a freelance artist and very talented singer, who works as a consultant for the Visual Arts Division of the Goethe Institut in Munich. Mathilde is immediately on my right. Next to her is Professor Alison Lewis, Professor of Linguistics at the University of Melbourne and an expert in post-war German culture and society. She lived in West Berlin for a couple of years at the end, or the start, of the 1980s. Correct? Yes? I think we took it from your text.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Sorry if that's not right.
It's all right, I'm having trouble hearing.
You can correct it.
Okay.
And we're delighted that Stuart Braun has been able to join us this evening. He's just flown back from Berlin. He's an Australian writer and a Berlin resident and author of a new book, City of Exiles, Berlin from the Outside In. Stuart moved to Berlin in 2009 and he became fascinated with the fact that so many people from outside the city seem to make it their home. He was particularly attached to exploring why it had such an allure for visionary artists musicians, and other free spirits from around the world. We don't have copies of Stuart's book tonight. It will be launched on December the 2nd at RMIT Gallery, and 5:30 to 6:30, and Stuart will be speaking specifically on that topic. Correct?
Correct. Here it is.
One copy. None of us have had a go at it. Okay. The screening will start immediately we finish. We think about 15 to 20 minutes of discussion. There'll be no interval. The film lasts for 94 minutes, and we're anticipating the event will finish at 8 p.m. We're a little bit over time now, maybe a few minutes later. The last thing, I ask you please to turn off or turn down the tone on your telephones. If you've got them in your bags, just check, are they on silent? We always think they're okay, but it doesn't necessarily happen that way. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel of discussants.
Well, thanks everybody. We've already been introduced, so we have Mathilde here, Mathilde Weh and Stuart Braun on my right. What we thought we'd do tonight is take you through Berlin at the time of the 80s, then take you through the music, and then particularly talk about the bands that are in Mathilde's exhibition, and talk then a little bit about the subcultures and this incredible attraction that Berlin had for, basically lots of people, including Australians, including people in Melbourne, and then maybe touch on Stuart's book. And then both Mathilde and Stuart will talk a bit about the film. Now, I just wanted to sort of talk about Berlin in the 80s, because it was still the Cold War, and I think it's something that people nowadays sort of tend to forget, that it was a really divided city. It was a city with a heavily fortified concrete, and barbed wire wall running down the middle. Now, it was divided into East and West Berlin. So we had East Berlin, which was still the capital of East Germany. So, it still retained its capital status. But West Berlin was in this weird sort of limbo status. It was effectively separated from the rest of West Berlin. It was no longer the capital. I think we sort of often forget that now. It was no longer the capital of West Berlin. That was in Bonn. So, in many ways, West Berlin was sort of like cut adrift from the rest of the country. It was a bit like a capitalist enclave in the middle of this sort of huge, communist, or like a capitalist island, if you like, in a communist sea. And I think that sort of geopolitical framework really affected life in both sides of the city. Now, Stuart, I gather you live now in Berlin, but you've written about the 80s in your book, haven't you, and what it was like. Could you maybe sort of say something about...
Sure. it was a defining time in terms of the 80s itself. It took so long for the city to, I suppose, repair after what happened in the war. It was an apocalypse, essentially. And it was still largely destroyed in the 70s and early 80s as this movement, these subcultures came to being. And I think it's important to remember that what had happened, you'd already had all these radicals like the Red Army faction, and you had essentially all the freaks and radicals and artists from Germany who really were very upset with what was happening in West German society. They felt like they'd sold out to the American imperialists. They felt that the Nazis were still running the country, a lot of them as well. And in a sense, that was kind of true. Denazification hadn't been as thorough. Anyway, there were a lot of ex-Nazis who had positions in government and stuff like that. Yeah. But apart from that, that's a bit earlier. But essentially, the reason they came to Berlin was because it was demilitarized from essentially from the beginning of the occupation. So if you were in West Berlin, you didn't have to join the army. And at that time, all the major industries, you know, Berlin had been the grand Prussian capital. You know, it was a city of 4.5 million. It had 1 million more than it has today, even in 1930. You know, at the sort of peak of the Weimar Republic. And then, so what happened was all the industry and Siemens, all these great companies left. There was nothing left. There was no work. What there was kind of refugees and these artists and these radicals who came there because it was so cheap to live and it was subsidised. And to keep this capitalist island alive within, again, it was the last bulwark against communism, essentially. And it was the front line of the Cold War, as most of you probably know. The only way to do that was to subsidise it and keep these people there somehow. So it was an island, it was a kind of no man's land, and people could just drift around in there and do whatever they want and they could be whatever they wanted to be. And that's kind of the background. And I think it's important, you know, and bands that we're going to talk about, like Einstürzende Neubauten, which means collapsing new buildings, was essentially about this sense of flux but also finding creativity amongst this destruction, you know, at making stuff out of found objects and stuff. So we'll get onto that, but I think that's an important background to what we're going to discuss and what this movie essentially discusses.
Yeah, Mathilde, do you want to say something about Berlin, like from your perspective, from a West German perspective? Because you didn't actually you were living in Düsseldorf, I think you said, and in Munich, but you no doubt went to Berlin a lot.
Yes, I don't live in Berlin, but in Düsseldorf. Yeah. And there was a scene too, a music scene too. But can I speak German and you translate? I think it's better for me.
You're doing great, you're doing great. You're doing a good job.
Yes.
Well, look, why don't we talk about the music? Because, you know, the 80s was this incredible sort of explosion of grassroots music. I mean, what we'd now call independent music, although we didn't sort of use the term back then. It was just these bands springing up in Berlin, but also Düsseldorf, Hamburg, Munich. I mean, I was in Erlangen at the time studying, and we had our own sort of local bands. And so, I mean, what sort of influences, what was influencing the bands? I mean, how would you classify it? How would you describe the music? Because it's quite sort of indefinable in some ways.
So I think they search another kind of music in the 80s. And they don't want to play the stadium rock music.
Yep, move away from prog rock and from crowd rock.
Yes, and it was not necessary to be a good musician, because everybody plays music. The artists, Kunsthochschulen,
art students
make music, films, and so on. It was genre-übergreifend.
Yeah, it crossed over, crossover or cross genres.
And some good musicians played another instrument to be not too good, too professional.
So that's sort of a technique that you get in art, isn't it? That, you know, people that can actually be trained artists but deliberately paint with their left hand or their other hand. And so you're saying that musicians played the instrument that they were least good at.
Yes.
Oh, God.
And the lyrics are in German, not in English.
Yeah. I mean, I remember at the time that was a really big thing, because I was there in the early 80s, and, you know, that they were singing in German. But I mean, were bands singing in English before, or was it just a bit of a tendency to sing in English? I mean,
yes,
Kraftwerk sang.
Kraftwerk was a little bit earlier in the 70s. Yes, that's right. But normally the groups sang in English. Yes.
To be more successful in the international market. Yeah. So the German language was really important. They didn't aim to be sort of successful, and they weren't at all interested in commercial, you know, getting commercial deals or record deals, were they?
That's right. Yes. They only want to make music and to experiment, to make experimental music, and it was not necessary to be what is it called, virtuos.
Yeah, you didn't actually have to be good at your instruments.
And also because you could live in, especially in West Berlin, without any money, essentially.
Yes.
The state basically paid your rent and you could survive on nothing, which helped as well. So you didn't need to be successful.
Yeah, that's right.
You know.
That's right.
And the Einstürzende Neubauten, they have had no money, and they played with other things.
That's right. They sort of improvised their
Schrottplatz.
instruments,
Yes.
And then of course in East Germany they just didn't have technologically sort of modern. Amplifiers were really hard to find. So they, I've seen in your exhibition there's a drum kit, which I think is a plastic drum filled with junk, filled with stuff.
And filled with Lego Steinen.
Oh, with
stones
Lego
of Lego
pieces. Okay, yeah. So they had, and I know some of the bands, instead of amplifiers, they used sort of radios and things like that, I think.
Yes. They built their instruments themselves.
Yeah.
Sie bauten die selbst.
So in terms of style, it was a real hodgepodge or völlige Mischung von Stilrichtungen, a bit of punk, post-punk, industrial, electronic. Yes. Were there sort of separate, schools, or was it all just pretty much, anything goes?
Yes, but in the exhibition we have 7 bands. They are really, also sind ganz anders.
Yeah, they're all quite different.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
The scene wasn't so defined. I mean, in terms of musical, there was no genre. It crossed over. The most important thing is that, as they say a lot in the exhibition, and I've got Blixer quoted here in the book and stuff, was that there are no boundaries.
Yeah.
And it was about, as you say, but it was avant-garde as well. It was experimental, but it was intellectual as well. It wasn't in this punk thing of just DIY, we can do whatever we want.
Yeah.
It was very intellectual, and they drew on, the 20s kind of Russian avant-garde and Walter Benjamin even, and it was quite actually sophisticated in a way, in the way they were sort of approaching this. It was an art installation, essentially.
It was the beginning of the performances and the videos and the music videos. The Tödliche Doris, the band Tödliche Doris, works with performance and with...
That's right. It was the more of the happening performance art end of it.
Yes.
They were all from art school, weren't they, from that band?
Yes,
yeah.
yes. Yeah. And the band Der Plan from Düsseldorf too.
Right, art school,
Yes,
yeah.
yes. And the lyrics were ironic.
Yep.
Ironic lyrics and very special. Very special.
The names of the bands too are sort of fascinating. Like the FSK, Freiwillige Selbstkontrolle, which is voluntary self-control, which is apparently a form of a classification used in cinema to, for mature audiences. I mean, so, they're very playful titles.
Self-censorship.
Self-censorship. Or, Einstürzende Neubauten, the collapsing new buildings. Or how do you translate that in your book?
Collapsing new buildings, yeah.
I love it. It's just sounds so bizarre.
Yeah, well, that was a very political comment on also the state of housing, the fact that they were getting all these they were selling off a lot of the old tenements and getting West German property developers to build all this dodgy housing and stuff. And he could see through the sort of politics of that and what was driving that. And he was sort of making a comment. He's saying that there was very bad quality prefab buildings that were probably going to fall down as quickly as the war brought down the old city kind of thing. But yeah. Yeah.
And then you've got the Deutsch-Amerikanische Freundschaft, the German-American friendship, which, I don't know, how do you read that? I sort of see that as...
I think it is ironic.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's obviously a commentary on Germany, West Germany's position in NATO as, close ally of the Americans and
And we had the band, they came from East Berlin.
Yeah.
It's called Ornament and Verbrechen.
Yeah, ornament and crime.
And crime,
That's
yes.
great.
And they were not allowed to play in East Berlin because of the name. Yes, the Piraten gigs, what is it called? They played Piraten gigs.
Oh, pirate gigs. That's a cool term. I haven't heard of that. Pirate gigs. Well, of course, the East was had its own subcultures, its own music culture, but wasn't quite as rich, from my understanding of it. Because, of course, in the East, everything had to be approved by the state. If you wanted to get a gig, you had to hand in a song list. You had to, you know, and you actually had to be a registered musician. You had to be a professional musician. So, you know, most of the bands in West Berlin wouldn't have been registered if they'd been in East Berlin. So when did Ornament und Verbrechen play? Was that towards the end of the regime? End of the 80s? It was more the end, wasn't it?
More in the end of the 80s, yes. Yes.
I think it's interesting that you talk about, I think they were quite deprived of access to music. They were able to listen to the radio and in West Berlin. But it's interesting that the main character in this film that you're about to see, Mark Reeder,
Yep.
who the narrative is formed around, he's an English guy from Manchester who came to Berlin, to West Berlin in 1978, and he's still there, and he's done a lot of amazing things, and you'll see some of his story here. But he was very interested in what was going on in the East, and I think a lot of foreigners were. For the West Germans, it was more difficult in a way, and I think they were conflicted. But he was the first guy to go over there regularly and start to try and join up the subcultures, and he put the first ever illegal gig with a punk band on in 1982 in East Berlin. He doesn't really go into it in B movie, but the Die Toten Hosen, the Dead Trousers, played it was basically in a church hall in 1982, and he did it again a few years later under it was a major operation, and he could have gone to jail for a long time for doing it. But that was sort of part of the movement in a way. That was the kind of thing you did, you know, and it was just about solidarity again and just doing it.
But they are very famous now in Germany.
Die Toten Hosen.
Die Toten Hosen are very famous. So were all the bands...
We're about done, I think.
Okay, right. All right. Now, would you like to say something about the Mark Reeder? You said that you have interviewed him, and...
Well, yeah, I mean, just quickly, a bit of background about the film. Mark Reeder, I interviewed him for this book, and I talked to him also about the film. He did some documentaries for BBC and for Channel 4 in the early 80s. And he had all this amazing footage that he thought was lost, he'd forgotten about. And there were all these other guys from the West Berlin scene who discussed the idea of trying to put something together. And I think they discussed it with you, didn't they, a few years ago? But it was actually a lot of this footage that you'll see actually came from Mark and the work he'd done on English TV, and it was lost. They thought it was lost, and they somehow found it in the archives. That's you'll kind of see him comparing stuff with another British woman.
So is it it's not a straight documentary? It's got all this original footage, but it's a...
I think it's not a straight documentary.
It's not a straight documentary,
no,
right?
No.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to say about the film? Okay, well, we're really looking forward to seeing it. I think you are too.